By the time I was heading back home, dusk had already settled over the street. Heavy gray clouds hung low over the rooftops, and a biting chill was blowing in from the riverfront. I lived on the edge of town in a crumbling Victorian, a relic with ornate trim, weathered shutters, and peeling paint. Honestly, the city should have condemned the place years ago, but somehow it stayed standing, like it had been forgotten by time. I'd inherited the unit from my grandmother. I couldn't really complain. Plenty of space, quiet neighbors, and even though the house was ancient, it stayed warm. Sometimes you'd notice it, a specific kind of silence. Nothing like the constant hum of engines, voices, and neon static you get downtown. Word was that back in the day, maybe the 70s, the building had been some kind of boarding school or a private orphanage. Later, they'd partitioned it into apartments and moved people in. Out of the 6 units, only 4 were currently occupied. There was a college kid on the second floor, Tyler, a quiet guy you'd barely notice. Next to him was a single mom, Sarah, with her 10-year-old son. They were always polite, but you could see a bone-deep exhaustion in Sarah's eyes. I'd heard she was scraping by on meager child support and whatever gig work she could find. Life hadn't been kind to them. On the first floor, right across from me, lived Mrs. Gable, a sweet old lady with kind eyes and an absolute obsession with needlepoint. That was the apartment I found open when I got home that evening. The door was cracked just an inch, barely noticeable, but it caught my eye immediately. Inside, it was pitch black. I stopped. A thought nagged at me. She was getting up there in years. What if she'd tripped or just forgotten to lock up? It was a quiet neighborhood, but leaving the door ajar like that was asking for trouble.
"Mrs. Gable?"
I called out, leaning toward the gap. Silence. I knocked, lightly at first, then harder. The sound felt jarringly loud in the sleeping house. I winced, a cold shiver crawling up my spine, as if some part of me already knew what was waiting inside.
"Mrs. Gable, it's me, your neighbor."
To be honest, I didn't want to go in. It's someone else's home. Maybe she'd just fallen asleep or stepped out to see a friend. But then again, an open door was an invitation for a break-in, and Mrs. Gable wasn't young. My heart sank. What if she'd had a stroke or a fall?
"I'm coming in,"
I announced before stepping inside. The hallway hit me with a wave of cold. It was bizarre. Usually, the building stayed toasty. The old radiators hissed like they were supposed to, but in here, it felt like a meat locker. There was a faint, cloying scent in the air, the smell of something damp and stagnant, like a flooded basement. I flicked on my phone's flashlight. The floral wallpaper was familiar enough, but it looked washed out and sickly under the blue LED beam. "Mrs. Gable, it's your neighbor." My heart started hammering against my ribs, and my legs felt like lead. A light was on in the kitchen. I headed that way, every floorboard creaking under my weight, making my pulse skip beats. Mrs. Gable was sitting at the table. As I got closer, I froze, a scream dying in my throat. She was perfectly still, her head slightly bowed. In her hands, she held her needlepoint, 2 kittens playing in a basket. It looked like she'd just paused for a second to think, except for one thing: her eyes. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing, and when I did, I nearly retched. Thick black thread had been crudely stitched through her eyelids, pulling them shut. The knots were so tight the skin had torn at the corners. Dried blood left dark, rusty streaks down her cheeks. Her mouth was sewn shut, too. The stitches were jagged and uneven, as if done in a frantic rage. Her teeth peeked through the torn flesh, and thin ribbons of dark, almost black blood had pooled at the corners of her lips. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at her. My brain flat out refused to make sense of it. What was this? Who would do this? Why? Suddenly, the air felt thicker, heavier. In the dark hallway, a shadow flickered and vanished into the bathroom. My chest tightened.
Who's there?
My voice was cracked and thin. Silence was the only answer. God, what do I do? It felt like a waking nightmare. 1,000 thoughts raced through my head. Is this some sick joke? Am I losing my mind? What if the person who did this is still here? As if to answer me, a soft thud came from the bathroom, something hitting the floor.
Oh, hell no.
My legs moved before I could think, bolting for the exit. Halfway out, I remembered I'd left my own door unlocked. My hand reached for the knob, but I yanked it back. There were streaks on the handle, something sticky and dark. Blood. Terrified out of my mind, I scrambled into my apartment, slammed the door, and threw the deadbolt. I didn't even make it 2 steps before my knees gave out. I slumped to the floor, back against the cold wood, shaking uncontrollably. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure the whole house could hear it.
What was that? Jesus, what was that?
The thoughts wouldn't stop. It felt like the house had suddenly come alive, like the walls had soaked up something ancient and foul. I closed my eyes, trying to get a grip. But the moment I did, the image flashed back. Mrs. Gable with her eyes stitched shut, her withered hands clutching that embroidery hoop. I snapped my eyes open and scanned my apartment.
I'm safe here. This is my home,
I whispered, like a mantra, but I didn't believe a word of it. Something clicked in the kitchen. Or did I imagine it? Probably just the house settling. I forced myself to stand. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I even hallucinated that the hallway mirror didn't show my reflection for a split second, but someone else's face.
Enough.
I tried to calm down, but a voice inside hissed. What if you're not alone? What if it followed you in? I was shivering like I'd been caught in an ice storm. I crept over to the sofa, sat down, and pulled a throw blanket up to my chin like it was armor. I fumbled for my phone. Should I call 911? What if they suspect me? I'd entered the apartment without permission. Evidence, fingerprints. I don't know how that stuff works. But in movies, the guy who finds the body is always the first suspect. I could already see the headlines. Local man arrested in brutal slaying of elderly neighbor. No. If I tell them the door was open and I just walked in, they'll think I'm lying. Why else would I be in there?
Not my business. Not my business,
I repeated. Every sound made me jump. The old house groaned. Floorboards popped. Something scratched in the attic. I was feverish. I didn't know what to do. My eyes were glued to the door. I could swear someone was standing right behind it, breathing, waiting. I wanted to hide, to disappear. Let someone else find her and call the cops, just not me. I sat in the dark for hours, afraid to move. I listened. From above and below, I heard sinister noises. Footsteps, quick and light, like a child running back and forth. And then laughter, high and thin. I never believed in the paranormal, but right then, the house felt sentient, trying to drive me mad. After a few hours, the icy grip of terror loosened just enough for me to think straight. You idiot, I muttered to myself. You should have called the police immediately. What normal person just sits here? But before I called anyone, I needed to know what was happening. Maybe the neighbors saw something. If I was going to be questioned, I needed an alibi. I got up, threw on a jacket, and opened my door as quietly as I could. The hollow echo of my steps in the hall made me flinch, but I kept going. I glanced at Mrs. Gable's door. Strange. It was closed. I stopped. The blood on the handle was gone. clean, like it had never been there. Doubt swirled in my head like a storm. I stepped closer, and fighting every instinct to run, I tried the knob. Locked.
What the hell is going on?
I whispered, feeling the fear surge back. I needed to talk to someone to tell me I wasn't going crazy. I headed upstairs to the single mom's place. Her door was slightly ajar, and the hair on my neck stood up. "Hello?" I called softly, pushing the door open a bit wider. It gave a long, slow creak that echoed through the stairwell. I stepped over the threshold and knew instantly that something was wrong. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, like life had been sucked out of the room. I walked into the living room. Sarah was on the couch, leaning over a book. Her son was on the rug playing with matchbox cars, eyes downcast. It looked like a perfect family portrait. Almost. I stood there, turned to stone. It was the same as Mrs. Gable's. I didn't even look at the boy's face. I already knew what was there. Silent and helpless, I recoiled, my skin crawling. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed, but where the signal bar should be, there was a red X. No service. I stared at the phone, powerless, as if looking at it would make the bars reappear. "What the fuck?" I breathed. A thought hit me. Tyler, the student across the hall. He had to have a phone, or at least some explanation. I ran back out, forgetting my own fear, and charged toward his unit. I didn't even knock. I just yanked the handle and it gave way. Unlocked. I stood in the doorway, my stomach knotting with a foul sense of dread.
Tyler, you in here?
I yelled and stepping inside. Silence. The living room was empty, the kitchen too. The place felt oddly hollow, though everything was in its place. I walked to the bathroom, took a deep breath, and shoved the door open. He was sitting in the tub, buried up to his neck in gray, dirty suds. His head was cocked toward the door, staring right at me. Eyes and mouth stitched shut with the same heavy black thread. I couldn't breathe. The mundane details made it worse. A bottle of Old Spice on the ledge, a loofah. But the water was dark, saturated with blood. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand.
Shit!
I hissed, choking on my own panic. I scrambled through the apartment, frantically searching for a phone. My hands fumbled over shelves, the couch, a desk piled with papers. Then I saw something that made me stop dead. Photocopies of old newspaper clippings, dozens of them. The one on top caught my eye, a photo of an old building. My building. The house looked malevolent in the photo, black hollow windows like empty sockets. The headline read, "Orphanage Closure." The tragedy buried in the walls. My legs felt weak. I couldn't look away from the text. January 16th, 1975. The St. Jude's Home for Children on Lee Street was shuttered following a discovery that shocked the nation. During a wellness check, local police discovered the bodies of 28 residents, ages 8 to 14, in the building's basement. Investigation revealed the deaths were linked to the systematic abuse of the head matron, Mary Ann Vance. It was uncovered that Vance had employed disciplinary measures of a horrific nature. Specifically, the suspect admitted to stitching the eyes and mouths of the children shut under the guise of protecting them from sin. According to her statement, she wanted to ensure they saw no evil and that their mouths spoke no evil. With every word, the air in the room grew colder. The next article mentioned that 30 years later, the former orphanage was renovated to give the building a second life in hopes of burying the tragedy. The world tilted. This wasn't a random act. Tyler must have found this out before me, but he couldn't get out in time. A horrific realization burned through me. This wasn't a serial killer, wasn't a person at all. It was the house, or whatever lived inside it. And now, it was coming for me. The floorboards creaked, like someone was running in the next room. I jumped. Today was January 16th, the exact anniversary of the closure. Exactly 50 years. I bolted for the exit and flew down the stairs. I had to get out of this godforsaken place. To my horror, the front door was locked tight. No matter how hard I threw my weight against it, it didn't budge. It didn't even rattle. The house wasn't letting me go. The windows had bars, and there was no back exit. What do I do? The basement. I remembered. There were small, narrow windows down there without bars, facing the north side of the street. It was my last shot. The basement door hung on rusted hinges. I shoved with everything I had, but it held firm.
Open up, damn you!
I rasped. Suddenly, from deep within the house, a low, drawn-out groan echoed. At that exact moment, the door creaked open, as if the house, sentient and mocking, was giving me a chance. The basement greeted me with an icy draft and a heavy silence. The humidity clung to my skin. My flashlight beam hit old, rusted pipes. Dust crunched under my boots. Thick cobwebs draped from the ceiling like funeral veils. The stench of rot was overpowering. On one wall, I saw drawings. Childish. Messy. The kids couldn't see what they were drawing. Lines crossed at weird angles, creating terrifying figures with X's for eyes and mouths. On the floor lay a broken Weeble-Wobble toy, a single child sneaker, rusted spoons, small crucifixes, and in the middle of the basement stood two metal bed frames without mattresses. Everything down there felt like it was trying to tell a story. Through my own heavy breathing, I heard a rustle. I swung the light around. There it was, a dollhouse. It was a perfect replica of this building. Every window, the roof, the doors, even the crack in the siding. Inside the dollhouse was miniature furniture and dolls. Every single one of them had their eyes and mouths stitched shut. In one room, a tiny rag doll sat hunched over a table, an actual needle in its hands. On the second floor, 3 more dolls, one with a book, one on a rug, one in a tiny bathtub. The last room was an exact copy of my own apartment. It was empty. For now. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and died. Total darkness. And then, a thin, childish voice.
You're too late.
Along the walls, I saw shadows, long, distorted things.
Play? Will you play? Come on, play with us.
The Weeble-Wobble toy on the floor tipped over with a dull thud. Laughter, high-pitched and piercing, erupted from everywhere. The shadows grew sharper. Thin, childlike figures with stitched-up faces.
You're going to play with us.
The voice echoed in my head. I tried to lunge for the door, but my legs buckled, like invisible hands were gripping my ankles. They started singing something, dragging out the words like a nursery rhyme. This was it. They were taking revenge for what happened 50 years ago, tormenting others the way they were tormented. One of the shadows leaned over me. I saw the needle, tiny and glinting.
You won't leave. Everyone stays.
I screamed, pressing my hands over my ears. My eyes started to pull shut on their own, like someone was tensing the lids. I felt a sharp prick at the corner of my mouth, sharp as a needle. A dark thread began to pull tight, sewing my lips together.
This is better.
the voice whispered.
You'll be just like us.
Panic surged, but a thought sparked in the back of my mind. It's a house. They're playing, and every game has rules.
Fine, I'll play,
I screamed. The laughter cut out instantly. I spun toward the dollhouse, grabbed it, and started shaking it violently, dumping everything out. The dolls hit the floor, the tiny furniture scattered.
How's that for a game?
I yelled, slamming the dollhouse onto the concrete. It cracked. The entire basement filled with a low roar. The shadows wailed, darting around like tongues of fog. This was my chance. I lunged for the window. The voices were sobbing in a dozen different tones. The narrow window was stuck. I grabbed a nearby brick and smashed it into the glass. It spiderwebbed. A second hit, then a third. The glass shattered. The cold night air poured in. I let out a feral yell. Squeezed through the opening with everything I had, and finally tumbled out onto the pavement. I lay on my back, gasping, staring at the house. The window I'd crawled out of looked like a mouthful of darkness. The house stood perfectly still. A dim light flickered in the windows, and in every single one, silhouettes stood. They didn't move. They just watched me with their X eyes. I scrambled to my feet, and without looking back, I ran.